Hey there, everyone. So today I figured I would sit in my specially echo-proof closet filled with a bunch of pillows and talk about some terrible, terrible takes about the metaverse. I feel like somebody has to defend the Zuck, and today, that's me. So recently, it seems like there's been a deluge of content about how terrible the metaverse is, how it's a worthless idea and it's going to ruin society, all that. And to be clear, I do think that there are lots of good reasons to be against the metaverse. There are just also lots of bad ones.
And it feels super dystopian. Okay, I want to experience nature in the real world. I want most of my social interactions to be in the real world. And this idea that most of our interactions will become this virtual space is a little scary, okay? I just want to go touch some grass.
You won't have to be yourself in the metaverse. You'll be replaced by an avatar, and that avatar, as Franzen says, won't experience some of those very human things we feel in the real world. At first, this will feel great for you. You'll settle right in. But then one day, you'll find yourself wanting to stay in this place of the easy streets and forego reality.
The metaverse will put you under a massive illusion. After making money in the metaverse, you'll feel productive. After falling in love in the metaverse, you'll feel incredible. After buying land in the metaverse, you'll feel accomplished. All your problems will disappear. You'll finally have community. You feel like you're achieving something great, like your life is finally intact. And it's this feeling of accomplishment that brings you back to the metaverse every single day. But it's only when you take off the headset and look around you do you realize you're a lab rat. You haven't achieved anything. You're alone, you're empty inside, you haven't made any progress, you were just tricked into thinking that you did. You haven't achieved anything.
So yes, having one company control basically the next wave of technology, probably a bad thing. Also, I think the presence of technological capabilities to actually do what Meta says it will do is somewhat dubious. But let's put that all aside, because the argument that I want to address today is that just because the metaverse is virtual, that it's somehow less valuable than the quote real world unquote. I could go on and on about the possible benefits of living in a virtual world. Just think of the lack of geographical limitation. I wouldn't have to drive cars, or deal with long plane rides, wait for public transportation, or deal with the emissions associated with any of those things. I could see anyone I wanted to from anywhere around the world in an interaction that feels like it's face to face, even if it's not actually. There's also the effective elimination of scarcity. I could have basically any material object I wanted, provided the simulation could support it, and I could code it into existence. If you, I don't know, want a sword, you don't have to buy metal, you don't have to learn metallurgy. But, bro machine, you could ask, what about those darn NFTs? Look at the actual facts of the matter. Even the most expensive metaverse properties, foot by foot, are about a third as expensive as San Francisco real estate right now. I don't think NFTs will ever reach the price of their real world counterpart, or else people just buy the real world thing instead. The entire economy of the metaverse would be based on the idea that you can live your dreams more cheaply, more accessibly in the metaverse than in the real world. And I think that means it's awfully likely the metaverse item will always remain cheaper than its real world equivalent. But what does it matter if none of it's real anyway, right? Well, I guess I think it's real enough, and I'm going to spend the rest of the video explaining why that is. To begin with, I think you should go on a little detour, or actually get to the central subject of the video, as I see it. Either way, this is Robert Nozick. He's a philosopher and an anarchist and an author, and he's generally based in red pilled, quite literally, as you will soon find out. In his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he posits the following thought experiment. Suppose there was an experience machine that would give you any experience that you desired. Super duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time you would be floating in a tank, with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life's experiences? It should be noted now that there are some major differences between this thought experiment and the real metaverse, as I will get to later. But for the time being, it's an interesting way of exploring the issue. In empirical studies, it's been found that between 19 and 29% of people would choose no. Note, that's a significant minority, but nonetheless a minority. Most people would rather live out their life with all of its up and downs than have a simulated one. In fact, the intuitive appeal of this thought experiment was thought to be so strong by Nozick that he thought of it as a knockdown blow against hedonism, the belief that the only thing that matters is pleasure. If pleasure is all that matters, he reasoned, then why would people choose to have a less pleasurable life just because it's, quote, real, unquote. Now, this argument is generally pretty well accepted among the philosophical community, but there are a few major rebuttals. The first one is that people are unable to accept the duration of time where they've decided that they want to enter this experience machine, but are not yet in it. In other words, they know they've decided to abandon the entire life that they already know in the, quote, real world, unquote, and yet they're not quite in the stage where their memories are erased yet and they can live happily in the other world. Nozick already anticipates this objection. He writes, "Nor should you refrain because of the few moments of distress between the moment you've decided and the moment you've plugged. What's a few moments of distress compared to a lifetime of bliss, if that's what you choose? And why feel any distress at all if your decision is the best one?" Another argument holds that people are just unable to imagine that they will be that happy in an artificial world. Realness, this argument goes, is seen to be a precondition of happiness, right? I can't have a happy experience if it's not a real experience. Therefore, even though the thought problem tells people that they will be infinitely happy within the experience machine, people still don't go for it because they have a false belief about how happy they will actually be. I think both of these rebuttals boil down to the idea that we cannot trust these intuitions because our calculational abilities are fundamentally biased. So even though it might just be a few minutes of suffering compared to a lifelong of bliss, because the suffering is so great and so immediate, I put a much higher value on it. Similarly, even if the thought experiment tells me that I will be infinitely happy, I just don't believe it. I just can't conceptualize that, and therefore I make the choice that's actually the wrong one for me, at least in a purely hedonistic sense. Interestingly, there have been recently a series of studies that reverse the thought experiment. Instead of an experience machine, this is a realness machine. In these, researchers ask participants, if you were in a simulation right now, would you decide to wake up into your real life or not? In general, the results of these studies are about 50-50 for going back versus staying in the current simulated reality, with the notable exception of those who are told that in their, quote, real, unquote, lives, they're actually a prisoner. Those people tend to decide to stay in the simulation about 90% of the time. Very understandably, I might add. In any case, there seems to be a notable discrepancy between the 19 to 29% who would enter the experience machine versus the about 50% who would stay in it. Researchers have pointed to status quo bias. In other words, that people want to stay in the lives that they're in now. Well, what do you know? Again, it's people's calculation abilities leading them to conclusions that aren't actually the best ones for them. But personally, I think the most devastating objection to the belief that the, quote, real world, unquote, is far more important than any virtual world is actually inherent in what I just said. The constant use of the, quote, unquote, in my reference to the real world has been pointing to the fact that our experiences of reality are actually inherently already quite abstracted from the nature of the world. We see chairs and doors, and I'm looking at a bunch of pillows right now, but actually none of these objects are inherent parts of the universe. Rather, they're just organizations given to the universe by humans because that's useful to us. In reality, at the fundamental sense of real, one could just say that there are basic particles and basic forces. Yet, that's not what we perceive. And I'm fine with that. In fact, if I were to ask you if you would rather spend your life sensing every single quark and every single strong force interaction, I think you'd answer no, because you don't care that much about the deepest sense of reality. You just care about your life now. Knowing that conclusion, doesn't it seem a little strange to say that one further level up of irreality is just too much? Right now we're at the perfect level of abstraction. Yeah, I don't think that that makes much sense. I just think, again, we're used to the world that we live in, and we don't want to change worlds. In fact, and take this with a grain of salt as it's coming from neither a philosopher nor a psychologist, but I would think that even those who decide to end the simulation in the reverse scenario still do it because of a status quo bias. They're just unable to imagine the status quo as truly virtual. They inherently assume that because we think of the real world now, that even in that hypothetical, their status quo would be the real world. Now, I said I'd go over some basic disanalogies between the experience machine and the metaverse, and I'll fulfill that promise now. I think that there are a few major ones. First of all, the metaverse does not necessitate you losing some memories, and the experience machine does. This is actually another source of conflict with the experience machine. People say that participants just really don't want to have their memories stripped of them, which would be necessary to actually convince them that they're living in a real world, even if they're in the experience machine. Another commonly cited reason why people don't go into the experience machine is the feeling of a lack of legacy. That is to say that they worry that they won't leave behind any kids, that nobody will remember them after they're gone. Luckily, with the metaverse, also not an issue. Other people will be there, other people can still remember you, you'll still have your name on the leaderboards if that matters to you. Lastly, and I think most disappointingly for me, the major difference between the metaverse and the experience machine is that I won't be infinitely happy in the metaverse. But as I already went over in the beginning, I think I will be somewhat happier in the metaverse than I would be in this world. In conclusion, maybe it's worth thinking about the things that we value in the real world. I would say that that's mostly other beings, maybe our pets, and our family and our friends. People don't seem to inherently value material possessions in the same way. I mean, just think about the fact that I would feel much the same if a prized possession got destroyed as if it, for example, fell down a cliff and I could never get it again. On the other hand, I would feel much sadder if a close friend died as opposed to a close friend somehow leaving the country and me never being able to find them again. Therefore, I can say that I inherently value my friend's existence, but I don't inherently value the existence of material objects. Well, luckily in the metaverse, material objects are replaceable and they're not real, but I think friends can join, you can have family members join, and hopefully one day you'll be able to have pets join. So everything that you care about would actually still be in the metaverse. I guess in conclusion, in general, I don't think that there's a good reason to just prefer reality over a virtual world, but to the extent that we actually value things in reality, those same things should be present and probably will be present in the metaverse. Let's just hope that eventually it's run by mammals rather than reptiles. Okay, it's not much later, as you can tell by the fact that I'm further away from the microphone and the gain of the microphone is up. And here's my Patreon question of the video. Definitely Real Patreon account asks, how are you so attractive and handsome? Well, very simple. Lots of plastic surgery.